Goeiemiddag dames en here, hartlik welkom by hierdie doktorale gradeplegtigheid van Universiteit Stellenbosch, die laaste van 2 geleenthede in hierdie kategorie. Welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. You make us very proud. You represent the excellence that we strive for at Stellenbosch University. In our own ranks, 61% of our staff now have doctorates. Although this is much higher than the national average of 41%, we are not yet at the 75% level, which is the aim of the Higher Education White Paper by 2030. I have no doubt that we will achieve the 75% long before then. As u al dus en reeds in personeellid is, het u 'n medeverantwoordelikheid om die volgende geslag doktorandi te help oplei. En as u nog nie vir ons werk nie, hou gerus die vakatures dop. Die ES was in 2014 een van die instellings met die mees aktiewe nadoktorale genoteprogram in die land, altesaam 247. Die doel van hierdie program is om 'n volgende generasie akademici toe te rus. Ons het ook 12 nuwe genootskappe vir die bevordering van navorsingsloopbane van die Nasionale Navorsingsstigting ontvang, wat 12 nuweling navorsers in staat stel om na 'n aanvanklike nadoktorale tydperk akademiese poste by die universiteit te aanvaar. Nurturing the next generation of academics is a vital part of maintaining our momentum of excellence. I'm glad to report that we are doing well. In the Times Higher Education World Rankings for 2014-2015, Stellenbosch moved into the top 300 category for the first time. But that does not mean that we should become complacent, far from it. And neither does obtaining one's doctorate mean that one now has all the answers. Tomorrow we will be awarding an honorary doctorate to a cosmologist, astrophysicist, Dr. Neil Turek. And he tells the story. He studies the Big Bang Theory. And he kept contact with his primary school English teacher. And at some point they met. She was already over 80 at the time, trying to explain to her in simple terms what he was doing. And then she asked him a very simple question. She asked him, what banged? This had a major influence on his future career path, because it is a question he never asked. So he went on, together with Stephen Hawking, and they developed the unified universe theory, which essentially says perhaps there are many Big Bangs happening all the time, and perhaps the Big Bang was not the start of the universe, perhaps it is just an event, and I wish I had time to explain in a bit more detail, an event in time happening. So we might, as we speak, there might be many Big Bangs going on around us. So perhaps Albert Einstein once explained this in the following way. He said, after a student asked him, Dr. Einstein, aren't these the same questions as last year's? These are in physics, in the physics final exam. And he answered, yes. But this year, the answers are different. So never stop searching for answers, even if you think you know them. Thank you. Ek sal nou aan die kandidate wat aan my voorgestel word, die onderskeie doktorsgrade verleen, and now confer on the candidates who are presented to me the respective doctoral degrees.
Meneer die visierektor, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte in die fakulteit lettere en sosiale wetenskappe aan die kandidate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I will present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Jafet Bakuva, with supervisor Professor Johan Mouton. Unfortunately, he fell ill and cannot be present, so I will deliver the commendatio on his behalf. Mr. Vice Rector, this study on the public understanding of the perceptions, beliefs, and attitudes towards climate change in Malawi constitutes one of the first studies of this kind on the African continent. The results of the study provide overwhelming evidence of the contextual nature of such beliefs and the underlying factors that explain these. Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer the degree on Jafet Bakuva. Karen Bernard with Supervisor Professor Christine Antonissen.
Mr. Vice Rector, in a critical linguistic analysis of corporate social responsibility discourse in 6 South African companies across a period of 3 years, Darren Bernard identified characterizing features of this relatively new generic form of communication. Her study highlights how a selective and limited set of devices are used, often misleadingly, to construct companies as social actors whose conduct is strategic, moral, and responsible. I request you to confer the degree on Ms. Bernard.
Penyo Butale, Professor Annie Gagihano will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, in this thesis, the candidate undertakes a comparative reading of post-colonial literature written in English in Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. The thesis explores the unique contribution of literature to offer insights into the lived realities of the poor by bringing into focus the similarities and differences between representations of poverty in these 3 countries. I request you to confer the degree on Penyo Butale.
And Crawford with Supervisor Professor Johan Mouton. I will deliver the commendatio on his behalf. Mr. Vice Rector, the candidate conducted a study on the merger of 2 major engineering firms in South Africa. In addition to major substantive findings about the construction of organizational identities pre- and post-merger, the study also makes a significant contribution to our understanding of how qualitative surveys can be used in studies of this nature. I request you to confer the degree on Anne Crawford. Amanda Erika de Beer, with Supervisor Dr. Rolf Annas.
Mr. Vice Rector, this study focuses on adventure novels set in Africa during the colonial period. Through analysis of German youth literature from the 19th century until the present, a contribution is made towards the depiction of Africa and the development of relationships between European settlers and African communities. I request you to confer the degree on Amanda de Beer.
Josephine Elizabeth de Villiers, with Supervisor Professor Kaimantri Moodley.
Mr. Vice Rector, this study offers timely and original insights into contemporary challenges experienced in nursing ethics education in South Africa and Namibia. Furthermore, it is the first empirical study conducted in this field, seeking perspectives of nursing educators in both countries. I request that you confer the degree on Josephine Elizabeth de Villiers.
Janan Janine Dietrich, with Supervisor Professor Ashraf Kaji.
Mr. Vice Rector, South Africa has the largest number of people living with HIV worldwide, with young persons most affected. The study used a mixed method design to adapt and pilot test a psychosocial intervention for adolescents in Soweto. The study provides a much-needed counseling tool for use among adolescents who participate in biomedical trials. I request you to confer the degree on Janan Dietrich.
Hendrik Jacobus du Plessis, with Supervisor Professor Adrian van Niekerk.
Mr. Vice Rector, this research developed a new geographic information science academic framework to serve as a standard for the training of such practitioners. It represents local and international perspectives of the knowledge and skills regarded as essential for the profession. The framework is currently being used to improve geographical information science academic programs at South African universities. I request you to confer the degree on Heinrich du Plessis.
Michael Gastro, with Supervisor Professor George Claassen.
Mr. Vice Rector, this study breaks new ground in science communication in Africa. It analyzes the allocation bid process of the Square Kilometre Array telescope in 2012 from two sides, those of the scientists and also the media. The study applies Habermas's theory of the public sphere to the process during the SKA bid. I request you to confer the degree on Michael Gastro.
Godfrey Hawaii, with Supervisor Professor Sandra Swart.
Mr. Vice Rector, dairy farming in colonial Zimbabwe, southern Rhodesia, has been used in this thesis as a lens into economic, social, and environmental factors in colonial agriculture from 1890 to 1951. Segregationist, racist agricultural policies have been examined, focusing on prejudices about the African body, milk, and hygiene. The candidates showed that Africans were unevenly affected by the policy. Some resisted and continue to compete despite the laws intended to marginalize them. I request you to confer the degree on Godfrey Hove.
George Biston Diston Javali, with supervisor, Professor Sandra Swart.
Mr. Vice Rector, this study explores hunting in the Lower Shiri Valley in Malawi. Oral testimonies were coupled to fresh primary evidence, which allowed this thesis to transcend the generalizations necessitated by previous macro overviews of Malawian historiography, offering instead a nuanced study of contestations between state and subject, between competing individuals, genders and generation, and enduringly, between human and animal. I request you to confer the degree on George Jawali.
Stanford Staples Long, I, as supervisor, will deliver the commendatio. Mr. Vice Rector, the study articulated a broadly understood and ethically founded sustainable development framework that may be used to address the tension that exists between development activities and environmental concerns. This led to a proposal of a sustainability charter for engineers within the South African context and suggestions towards the education of sustainability engineers. I request you to confer the PhD degree on Stanford Staples Long. Heidi Lawrence with promoter Professor Leslie Schwartz.
Mr. Vice Rector, this phenomenological study of the experiences of visually impaired students at 2 South African universities reveals myriad physical, practical, and emotional challenges faced and largely successfully managed by the students. Despite valuable steps towards inclusion, visually impaired students were still not fully included at either university, and the thesis provides important lessons for more inclusive academic practices. I request you to confer the degree on Heidi Lawrence.
Petsizai Leslie Mangesu, the supervisor, Professor Stephen Robbins.
Mr. Vice Rector, this anthropological study focuses on xenophobic exclusion and the social construction of masculinities amongst Zimbabwe male migrants in Stellenbosch and Cape Town. The study engages with the burgeoning critical masculinities studies literature, as well as on studies on xenophobia and migration. It examines how Zimbabwean male migrants create social and spatial separations between themselves and South African nationals. For instance, when football-playing migrants in Stellenbosch seek to address perceived threats and exclusion by establishing safe, enclaved male domains where they feel comfortable asserting their identity as Zimbabwean men. The thesis concludes that the threat of xenophobia does not deter Zimbabwean male subjects from migrating to South Africa, but it does lead them to map urban spaces in a very specific way. Thank you.
Belinda Nyarayi Busi Mazvikwa, with Supervisor Professor Amanda Gous.
Vice Rector, this dissertation examines how marginalized Black African women exercise their citizenship agency by asking how they understand themselves as citizens, navigate their structural barriers, and develop strategies to negotiate their relationship with the state. Using in-depth case studies of women living in Zimbabwean and South African townships, the candidates showed that both sets of women identify more with a communitarian definition of citizenship, and that home ownership and the cultural ethos of Ubuntu play a role in encouraging formal and informal political participation, respectively. Additionally, the women use a range of everyday resistance strategies to claim substantive citizenship rights from the state. I request you to confer the degree on Belinda Mazvikwa.
Emmanuel Simo Mayeza, Professor Stephen Robbins will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, the supervisor is Professor Robert Patman. The thesis is based on an ethnographic study which explores how boys and girls in a township primary school near Durban understand and experience schooling and play, and how play operates to produce certain kinds of identifications. Departing from traditional ways of thinking about children's social worlds from the perspectives of adults, the study seeks to explore the meanings which boys and girls themselves attach to play. It carries important implications for working with children in research and in education in ways that critically engage with their own constructions of stereotypes of masculinity and femininity through play. I request you to confer the degree to the student. Congratulations.
Almas Fortunatus Mazigo, as Dr. Magdalena Ngaiza of the Institute of Development Studies of the University of Dar es Salaam was co-supervisor of the study and is present here today. She will deliver the commendatio on my behalf.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, Vice Rector, the candidate examined the persistence of poverty in the fishing communities of Ukerewe in Tanzania and noted a flawed tacit development ethic. He then constructed a model, the sufficient capabilities and wealth ethic, Sukawe, as an explicit alternative, offering empowering moral resources that can inspire wealth creation and combating poverty. Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer the degree on Almas Fortunatus Mazigo.
Mzoko Mbulelo Mdunzelwa with Supervisor Professor Simon Becker.
Mr. Vice Rector, the Hostel Redevelopment Program in South Africa is an initiative aimed at converting single men hostels into family units. In this thesis, how public participation fashioned either satisfaction or dissatisfaction of beneficiaries is investigated in two separate hostel redevelopment programs. High participation led to satisfaction in one case, the converse in the second case. I request you to confer the degree on Lusuku Mdunelwa.
Fred Munga with Supervisor Professor Sulina Green.
Mr. Vice Rector, this study found that it was possible and affordable to provide social protection for children in Zambia, provided that proper targeting, prudent resource mobilization, and sound management were adopted. A coordinated, child-focused social protection system that takes economic realities of the country into account is recommended to address limited and fragmented interventions. I request you to confer the degree on Fred Munga.
Janine Hester Nell, the Supervisor Dr. Frenette Southwood.
Mr. Vice Rector, the candidate studied later developing constructions in the language of grade 1 learners. She found that learners who are not taught through medium of their first language have significantly poorer language skills at the beginning, but also still at the end of their grade 1 year compared to their peers who receive tuition in their first language. I request you to confer the degree on Ioanni now.
David William Willifier with Supervisor Professor Lindy Heineken.
Mr. Vice Rector, this study examines the physical as well as the social benefits of urban agricultural projects run by non-governmental organizations in Cape Town. Using the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, it shows that urban agricultural projects not only provide a degree of food security and income, but also have the ability to empower people, strengthen communities, and contribute towards building healthy ecosystems on the Cape Flats. However, the uptake and sustainability of urban agriculture in Cape Town is limited by bureaucratic hurdles to land access, donor funding, and dependency. I request you to confer the degree on David Willifier.
Letuku Elias Paatla with Supervisor Professor Janus van der Westhuizen.
Mr. Vice Rector, using a comparative historical approach, this thesis shows how social forces played a crucial role in shaping different types of welfare regimes in South Africa and Mauritius. More restrained social forces meant a more liberal welfare model emerged in South Africa, whilst a more resilient civil society led to a much more expansive welfare model in Mauritius. I request you to confirm the degree on Elias Letuku Fala.
Samantha Priga-Pinaar, Dr. Marley Pretorius will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, in this artistic research, the principles and practices of contact improvisation are employed to demonstrate this thematic form's potential as a complex system of embodied knowing. Characteristics of nonlinearity, paradox, emergence, and additional capacity are foregrounded in an interdisciplinary study, demonstrating the value of contact improvisation in tertiary educational contexts. I request you to confer the degree on Samantha Priga-Pinaar.
Salome Marianne Teutenberg met promotor professor Pierre de Tooy.
Mr. Vice Rector, South Africa's negotiated transition to democracy is hailed as exemplary. But by 2014, evidence was accumulating of an emerging discord on what our Constitution embodies, represents, and stands for. This study found that this discord was already present during the formal negotiating process of 1991 to 1996, especially about whether we were creating a social contract or not. I request you to confer the degree on Salome Marianne Teutenberg.
Glenn Leslie Thompson with Supervisor Professor Albert Grindling.
Mr. Vice Principal, in a novel and pioneering investigation, the candidate has explored the convoluted ebb and flow of 20th century South African surfing histories and clearly located these within a local and wider comparative context. The work's core analytical dimension, that is, the complicated construction of identities, habits, routines, places, and competitions, the whole panoply of culture, politics, ethnicity, and gender being disaggregated with a highly sophisticated level of critical understanding. Mr. Vice Rector, I ask you to confer the degree on Glenn Leslie Thompson.
Mr. Vice Rector, if we can write the history of rugby, we can also write the history of surfing. Meneer die vice-rektor, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte postuum aan Marie Elisabeth van Zyl te verleen. Mevrou van Zyl is oorlede nadat al die assessering van die proefskrif suksesvol afgehandel is. Voordat u die graad verleen, sal die promotor, professor Amanda Gous, 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mevrou van Zyl se lewensvernoot, Pauline Mitchell, sal die graaddokumentasie in ontvangs neem.
Vice Rector, this dissertation engaged the question of whether the legalization of same-sex marriages through the Civil Unions Act has contributed to a sense of belonging among gay couples. Using Nira Yuval Davis's conceptualization that includes belonging, consisting of identity, social positionality, and political values, and the politics of belonging to analyze the narratives of 17 same-sex couples, the candidates showed that the participants' most significant sense of belonging is derived from the protection of their rights in the Constitution. Claiming rights was the outcome of powerful struggles for belonging. For most, the Civil Unions Act contributed to a sense of belonging. We have lost a brilliant scholar. It was a privilege for me to have had her as a student. I request you to confer the degree on Mickey van Zyl posthumously.
Meneer die vice-rektor, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte en die fakulteit opvoedkunde aan die kandidate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Mr. Vice-Rector, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor Philosophy in the Faculty of Education. As in the previous faculty, the supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Raymond Ndubisi Anyanwu, Professor Leslie Lagrange will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Rector, climate change is one of the pressing problems facing humanity. In this study, the candidate investigates the literacy of geography teachers in two domains, climate change science and climate change pedagogy, and finds that the climate change science literacy to be high, but the climate change pedagogical literacy to be low, and argues that these two domains need to be integrated in professional development programs of teachers to ensure effective climate change education in schools. I request you to confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Raymond Anyanwu.
Vincent Charles Bosman, with Supervisor Professor Ellie Bitzer.
Mr. Vice-Rector, the potential growth amongst first-year students from a dyadic relational perspective was the focus of Mr. Bosman's study. Communication among mentors and mentees was analyzed within the context of a university residence. The findings indicate that student mentoring is an effective means of facilitating the transition from a school to university and universities, and all universities have a joint responsibility in this regard. I request you to confer the degree on Vincent Charles Bosman.
Christel Ekron met promotor Professor Christa van der Walt.
Mr. Vice Rector, in a longitudinal study on the classroom communication behaviors of Bachelor of Education students, the candidate found that such behaviors did not develop spontaneously over a 4-year period of school teaching practice. The study recommends that quality instructional communication needs to be developed more directly in teacher education programs. I request you to confer the degree on Christel Ekron.
Henry Phillies met promotor Professor Aslam Fattar.
Mr. Vice Rector, this thesis discusses the learning practices of selected high school students in an impoverished rural space in the Stellenbosch district. Based on an 18-month ethnographic study, the thesis presents an acute reading of how these students construct their learning practices in tough circumstances. Combining the lenses of Bordeaux, Appadurai, and Moll, the candidate illustrates how they strategically accumulate and use their life knowledges and family and peer literacies to secure a tenuous yet tenacious foundation for their educational aspirations. The thesis highlights the difficult life paths that these students navigate in order to establish viable educational futures. I request you to confer the degree on Henry Phillies.
Lamson Zondiwe Mkabela with supervisor Dr. Liesel Frick.
Mr. Vice Rector, Zondi Mkabela investigated leadership learning in a rural local municipality, which is highly relevant given our national context. Due to Mr. Mkabela's study, we now have proof that such leadership learning interventions may have limited success if there is political intrusion and systematic instability, and as such, he makes a valuable contribution to our understanding of leadership learning in this particular context. Nkomo, Mungana. Today, the ancestors are proud. Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer the degree on Mr. Zondi Mkabela.
Catherine Ann Robertson with supervisor Dr. Liesel Frick.
Mr. Vice Rector, Kathy Robertson developed a curriculum framework for leadership development in the vocational education sector in South Africa. She found that no such curriculum framework existed while it did in other international contexts. She also found that there were dichotomies between management and leadership within the sector, which created unique opportunities for us to develop something that was highly contextual and relevant, and that will be used in future in order to develop contextualized interventions and curricula for these particular leaders. Kathy, you inspire us all, but none more so than your grandchildren. Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer the degree on Catherine Robertson.
Cosmas Toga Tambara with Supervisor Dr. Helena Wessels.
Mr. Vice-Rector, against a background of poor overall mathematics achievement in the National Systemic Evaluation, Mr. Tambara investigated foundation phase teachers' pedagogical knowledge, beliefs, and practices in mathematics. He found that a professional development program focused on problem-based learning and problem-solving enabled teachers to teach mathematics for understanding. I request you to confer the degree on Mr. Tambara.
Andre James Fenebel with Supervisor, once again, Dr. Liesel Frick.
Mr. Vice-Rector, Andre Fenebel investigated mentoring by using the work of Fairclough and Foucault, specifically, again, within the vocational education sector in South Africa. He found that while different mentoring practices existed in this sector, many of these newly appointed staff members could develop their own set of mentoring systems within these environments, and as such provides work for future development and new understandings of mentoring within vocational education. Andre, we hope you continue this work at CPUT. Mr. Vice-Rector, I ask you to confer this degree on Mr. Andre Fenebel.
Milton Lester van Wyk met promotor Professor Leslie Lagrange.
Meneer die visierektor, in ons samelewing word waarde toenemend geheg aan net wat meetbaar is. En hierdie verskynsel het die Franse filosoof Lyotard performativiteit genoem, die kortste inset-uitset verhouding. In hierdie studie ondersoek die kandidaat hoe primêre skoolonderwysers die tegnologie van performativiteit beleef. En hy vind dat die ervarings gaan gepaard met neeweffekte soos fabrikasies en ook dat die onderwysers kies om die onderwys vroeër te verlaat. Ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan Milton van Wyk te verleen.
Mr. Vice-Rector, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Laws in the Faculty of Law. A brief outline of the dissertations will be given on behalf of the supervisors. Karen Besaidner, Professor Zaza Boggenpoel, co-supervisor, will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Rector, the South African Constitution proscribes arbitrary deprivation of property. The candidate investigated novel alternative solutions to invalidating otherwise lawful but excessive regulatory deprivations of property. She identified innovative remedies that allow courts to uphold regulatory measures even if it imposes an excessive burden on property owners. The study concludes that deprivation of property may result in excessive regulatory burdens being suffered by property owners, provided the regulatory purpose is necessary and compensation is paid. Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer the degree on Karen Besaidenout.
Demisel Petherbridge, Professor Sandy Liebenberg, co-supervisor, will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, the South African Constitution obliges courts to consider international law when interpreting the Bill of Rights, including the socio-economic rights enshrined therein. The candidate analyzed and evaluated the Constitutional Court's use of international law to interpret these rights. The study's seminal contribution is to demonstrate how international law can play a critical role in strengthening the enforcement of socio-economic rights, rights which are vital not only to people's material well-being, but to their human dignity. I request you to confer the degree on Demisel Petherbridge.
Meneer die visierektor, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte in die fakulteit Theologie aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy in the Faculty of Theology. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Brian Rendell Biedebach, with supervisor Professor Xolile Simon.
Mr. Vice Rector, in Malawi, a spectrum of Christian witness models exist, focusing on verbal proclamation or social action. In the light of Christian witness models in the New Testament, which models do Western missionaries in Malawi prefer and why? With a survey of Protestant missionaries in Malawi and a focus group discussions in the United States of America, the research identifies social and theological patterns in each model. It constructed a model of discipleship which emphasizes proclamation, includes social action, but also challenges local and global missionary practices. I request you to confer the degree on Brian Rendell Biedebach.
Jacobus Johannes Karno with supervisor Professor Christo Tesnaar.
Mr. Vice Rector, this study offers an in-depth engagement with how poor black older persons suffered the defacement of their dignity under apartheid within the context of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Southern Africa. The candidate links a moral economy with liberation theology to affirm their dignity through the values of reciprocity, responsibility, and interdependence. I request you to confer the degree on Jacobus Johannes Karno.
Marlene Suzette Maokoto met promotor professor Johan Silje.
Mr. Vice-Rector, through empirical research done in a selection of congregations in the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, the candidate concludes that in spite of many societal challenges like poverty, inequality, abuse, violence, and corruption facing the country, some faith communities still seem reluctant to articulate these issues by means of lament during their worship services. The researcher furthermore contends that because lament cannot be understood theologically without a relearning of the language of hope and vice versa, a rediscovery of the appropriate role of lament in the liturgy will also aid in bringing hope and healing to the community. Mr. Vice-Rector, I request you to confer the degree on Marlette Suzette Maokoto.
Edson Mbwazana Siwela with supervisor Professor Xolile Simon.
Mr. Vice-Rector, the contemporary Christian demographic shift towards a two-thirds majority world has resulted in a proliferation of African independent churches, including the Zionist churches. Combining theological and grounded theory approaches, the research explored narratives of Zionists to explain the role and outcome of healing processes. Their spiritual quest in Khayelitsha and Masiphumelele in Limpopo province connect aspects of healing, spirits, and the Holy Spirit. This grassroots practice should contribute to and shape conversations with Zionists and academic discourse about Zionists today. Ek versoek u om die graad in Edson Mbwazana Siwela te verleen.
Meneer die vice-rector, ek versoek hier om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte in die fakulteit Geneeskunde en Gesondheidswetenskappe aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Rector, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. And ladies and gentlemen, just to remove all doubt about what the faculty is that we're from, it is the faculty that caused recently lots of national and international excitement because of some unique surgery that was performed. Charles Awarty with supervisor Professor Bernd Rosenkrantz.
Mr. Vice-Rector, many patients combine prescription drugs with traditional medicines. Charles Awarty investigated the effect of 7 herbs commonly used in South Africa on enzymes and transporters involved in drug elimination. He found that herbs may have a profound influence on blood levels of prescription drugs and therefore their efficacy or toxicity. I request you to confer the PhD degree on Charles Awarty.
Philippa Ann Black, Professor Rob Warren, co-supervisor, will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, Philippa Black's thesis describes the use of novel approaches to identify heterogeneous polymorphisms in clinical isolates of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Her findings have challenged the dogma that tuberculosis disease is clonal, and in so doing has highlighted the complexity of adaptive mutational events during disease and the role of evolutionary bottlenecks imposed by anti-tuberculosis drugs. Her research has also investigated the effects of efflux pump inhibitors as adjuncts to TB treatment. She showed strain-specific restoration of drug susceptibility. Together, these findings will guide the development of novel drugs and diagnostics and the design of new treatment regimens for tuberculosis. I hereby request that you confer the degree on Philippa Black.
Muhammad Razeen Davids, Professor Yusuf Chikta, co-supervisor, will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, an e-learning program for electrolyte and acid-base disorders was developed, then tested with end users and experts. Serious usability problems were identified which limited the educational impact. User testing and expert evaluation each detected problems missed with the other method. Usability evaluation using multiple methods is critical in successfully implementing e-learning. I request that you confer the degree on Muhammad Razeen Davids.
Michelle Dyer, with Supervisor Professor Eileen Hole van Helden.
Mr. Vice Rector, Michelle Dyer has applied novel computational and statistical techniques to large genotypic tuberculosis case and control data sets that were collected from the admixed South African coloured population. This was done to better understand the population genetics, the impact of ancestry, and to generate new hypotheses regarding genetic factors that underpin progression to tuberculosis. I request you to confer the degree on Michelle Dyer.
Penelope Marjorie Anderson, with Supervisor Professor Rob Gee.
In her thesis, Mrs. Anderson describes her development and implementation of a health intervention that resulted in a 30% countrywide decrease in hospital deaths from childhood pneumonia. This excellent health systems research demonstrates, for the first time, that at a country level, it is possible to decrease the deaths from childhood pneumonia. This excellent study by an inspirational lady in her 8th decade of life is worthy of respect. Mr. Vice Rector, I ask you to, oops, we lost the words. Typical. To confer the degree of PhD on Penny Anderson.
Professor Guy was clearly overwhelmed with that. Lauren Rosley Fairburn, Professor Daniels, co-supervisor, will deliver the commendation on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, we all know that we live in a very violent society where vulnerable individuals are severely affected and very often go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Ms. Lauren Fairburn study looked at a combined intervention of fear extinction and D-cycloserine administration as a possible alternative therapeutic strategy, since managing these patients are not resolved and remains problematic. Her data showed that fear facilitated extinction of the learned fear, and that the DCS actually provided a very useful alternative augmentation. Ek versoek u graag om die graad aan Lauren Rosley Fairburn te verleen.
Pierre Gossard met promotor Professor Guy.
Well, I failed the first time. Let's try again. In his thesis, Dr. Gossard describes the investigation and management of 250 children with life-threatening tuberculosis. In addition, he developed a new diagnostic technique in children to confirm the diagnosis of tuberculosis in complicated cases. From this, he developed a treatment algorithm to safely manage these vulnerable children. I request you to confer the degree of PhD on Pierre Gossard.
Well done, Professor Guy. Kathleen Grant with Supervisor Professor Marita Kotze.
Mr. Vice Rector, breast cancer genetics is a major health problem. The candidate studied this disease in the context of tumor pathology, underlying 4 major subtypes of the disease that differ in their response to treatment. She applied a novel pathology-supported genetic testing strategy, which resulted in the safe avoidance of chemotherapy in the majority of the South African patients that was included in this study by using advanced microarray technology. I request that you confer the degree on Kathleen Grant.
Our professors will need some anxiety medication, it seems. Marissa Klopper, Professor Rob Warren, mede-promotor, sal die verklaring namens die promotor doen.
Mr. Vice Rector, Marissa Klopper's thesis was the first in-depth molecular investigation of drug-resistant tuberculosis epidemic in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. She identified and characterized a dominant Mycobacterium tuberculosis strain type that was resistant to all available anti-tuberculosis drugs. controversially termed totally drug-resistant tuberculosis. She showed that this strain was endemic to the Eastern Cape and spreading to the Western Cape. Using whole genome sequencing, she identified genetic markers that could be used to rapidly screen for infection with this highly resistant strain. I hereby request that the degree be conferred on Marissa Klopper.
Annie Petronella Landman, Professor Scott Drimmie will deliver the commendation on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, Annie Landman's qualitative study investigates institutional blockages and catalysts for knowledge policy transfer in the Southern African Development Community Vulnerability Assessment Committees, or VACs. Drawing on complexity theory, the socio-ecological systems framework, and the policy arrangement approach, the study uses computer-assisted discourse analysis. The candidate argues that the VAC, despite identified challenges, remains strategically positioned to facilitate knowledge policy transfer to reduce regional vulnerability, and that research can powerfully contextualize policies in complex arrangements. I request you to confer the degree on Annie Landman.
Edward Nicol with Supervisor Professor Lillian Dudley.
Mr. Vice Rector, this multi-method study of the quality and use of routine data for monitoring and evaluating the prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV identified numerous deficiencies in data quality as well as in the competencies of health information staff and managers to interpret and to use data. It also found that poor feedback affected data quality and use. I request you to confer the degree on Edward Nicol.
Bongani Brian Nkambule, Dr. Davidson, co-supervisor, will deliver the commendation on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, HIV infection is associated with higher levels of inflammation and platelet activation, which are linked to heart disease and strokes. This study developed methods for testing platelet function and showed that platelets may be hyperactive in HIV. This would help identify patients at risk of heart disease and facilitate earlier treatment. I request you to confer the degree on Mr. Bongani Brian Nkambule.
Michael Pather with Supervisor Professor Bob Mash.
Mr. Vice Rector,
Improving the quality of primary care is a national priority, and bridging the gap between research evidence and implementation in practice is a key issue. Dr. Pather investigated how to bridge this gap using the specific example of the National Asthma Guideline and developed a model of how to implement evidence-based guidelines in primary care. I request you to confer the degree on Dr. Michael Pather.
Ronald van Toren met promotor Professor Johan Skuman.
Mr. Vice Rector, Dr. van Toren challenged existing ways of treating children with tuberculosis of the brain. This included a simplified staging system and successfully halving duration of drug treatment with excellent clinical outcome. He also described new ways of investigating and treating complications such as tuberculous brain abscess and raised intracranial pressure. I therefore request you to confer the degree on Dr. Ronald van Toren.
Susara Johanna Versace met promotor Professor Leslie Swartz.
Mr. Vice Rector, the candidate analysed health service delivery challenges for disabled people in a remote part of South Africa. In fact, it's the first such study conducted in the Northern Cape. Exacerbating the obvious geographical challenges are resource allocation issues, communication difficulties, and the application of suboptimal care protocols. Free health care, intermittent access to good tertiary care, and outreach services facilitated care. Recommendations for future interventions are made. I request you to confer the degree on Sirona Versace.
Corley Westcott, Dr. Murray sal die verklaring namens die promotor doen.
Mr. Vice Rector, Mrs. Westcott investigated the effects of cholesterol-lowering drugs on the vascular endothelial cells. Her study generated novel data, particularly with regard to the ability of the drug fenofibrate to generate large amounts of the protective molecule nitric oxide. This study demonstrated that these drugs exert cholesterol-independent effects on the vascular system. I request you to confer the degree on Corley Westcott.
Mr. Vice Rector, I request you to confer the degree below the stage on Lucille Wood. Professor Bernd Rosenkrantz will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice Rector, the candidate was involved in the establishment of the first ever bone marrow transplantation center in Africa for certain blood diseases, mainly cancers. Transplantation carries the risk of rejection. A new medicine, Campat, was studied that significantly reduced rejection, and patients also had overall better health in the later years. I request you to confer the PhD degree on Lucille Witz.
Ek verleen die doktorsgrade aan die kandidate in hulle afwesigheid. I confer the doctoral degrees on the candidates in their absence. I include the degree posthum awarded to Marie Elizabeth van Zyl. Dames en heren, nou dat die toekenning van die doktorale grade nou afgehandel is, wil ek namens die Universiteit Stellenbosch vir almal van u wat vandag hierdie hoogste kwalifikasie verwerf het, van harte gelukwens met die prestasie.